Hello, everybody. Pastor Mathew here, Zion Lutheran Church. Welcome back to part 5 in our Bible study series on Ezra and Nehemiah called Return and Rebuild, an ancient story for a modern church. I'm so glad you're able to come back to us and continue in this study. I mean, we've gotten far so far. We've already finished the book of Ezra, which is an accomplishment on its own. And today, we're going to be looking into the book of Nehemiah, finishing the kind of our trilogy of 3 stories here, rebuilding Jerusalem's walls, looking at the first 7 chapters of the book of Nehemiah. And so I'm glad you're with us today. The first thing that we're going to do, as we've done for the past several weeks, is just kind of remind you of where we have come from this past week. So in some ways it plays a role into what we're going to be talking about. In other ways, I mean, we've moved on from a different time period, but it's kind of good to know just in case you've forgotten a little bit of what's taken place in the past couple days. And so 3 points to remember from last time. We did meet Ezra for the first time. Ezra only shows up in his book for the second half of it. And we know that Ezra was well versed in the law of Moses, and now that the temple had been rebuilt, and the rhythms and the patterns were reestablishing themselves in Jerusalem, now it was time to go and teach the people the foundation for everything that they were doing. And so Ezra was sent to teach the Torah. That was our theme for last week, the last half of the book of Ezra. The Torah, of course, being the law of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so that's what Ezra was sent to do. But of course, just like with the first story, within our second story, we encountered some opposition from within. So this is from the first opposition we faced in the first half of Ezra came from the people who had already been living there. They wanted to help. This last week, the opposition came from within their own community of exiles. I'll bring it back to me here. And so within the community of those exiles that came back from Babylon, from the Persian Empire, there came this opposition because the people had started intermarrying with people that had been living there, who they would say were not part of their holy race. That term kind of came up last time, and it can strike a chord with us nowadays. And so this had the potential to kind of throw us off track because of that, because we went into different pieces of the Old Testament to look at this different argument, the different sides of the argument around what Ezra did. We'll talk about that in a second. That it showed us some uncertainty on the idea of marriage between an Israelite and a foreigner. And we talked about a few well-known characters that married outside of the Israelite race. Abraham being one of them, Moses being another one of them. And there were some others that we had mentioned too, that they did not marry Israelites. They married people from other races. But we also saw prophecies from other prophets talking about how divorce was bad and how they shouldn't have maybe interpreted it that way. But we see that Ezra makes a decision and sticks with it. And that's our third point here, what I've just called pulling an Ezra. And that's just a way of talking about how Ezra made his decision based on what was going on. You see with the intermarrying going on, it's kind of an iffy area of the law, and maybe it wasn't the best decision because there's nothing that spoke as closely to it. But Ezra made a decision on his own. He interpreted the law the best that he could, given the circumstances he was involved with, because there was, again, nothing specific to the situation he was in. Could he have acted differently? Of course he could have. But he sent the wives and the children away, and nothing further is really known about them. They never come up in the book again. Could he have let it go if these people were intending to be devout to Moses' law? If those couples, those families said, we're coming back, we want to help, we want to be a part of this, we want you to teach us the law, and we want to be God's people. Could Ezra have let it go? Well, of course he could have. But given the situation, he was more concerned about centering that identity in who these people were as a chosen race by God. And he felt that it was for the best, for that particular moment, that he do what he did. And now we may have situations today where we need to pull an Ezra, so to speak, where the Bible isn't quite clear on what we should do. We may have to prayerfully interpret Scripture. We might have to make a choice and stick with it. Might it be unpopular? Yeah, absolutely it could. Could we have made a better decision in another direction? Absolutely. But is our choice important for the goal that we are working toward? Absolutely. Yes. And so returning and rebuilding is not always a clear path given to us in Scripture, as we can see here. There are times that we need to interpret and boldly move forward. And so that's kind of where we were last week in the second half of the book of Ezra. But before we get into Nehemiah, now that we have finished the book of Ezra, I want to point out something that I kind of failed to make clear throughout reading this. And it can help us to see the book in a different light. And this may be helpful for you, it may not be. But the question was brought up, and I want to address it even though it's a couple weeks later, that Ezra is not written in chronological order. I'm going to show you this image here so you can see where we have basically the book of Ezra laid out in a couple chunks. The first story that we talked about are the first three chunks, Ezra 1 through 622. That's basically Ezra chapters 1 through 6. That's the first story. And then Ezra 7 through 1044, that's Ezra 7 through 10. That's the second story that we went through just last week. And as you can see in the image, there are a few verses in chapter 4 that are kind of indented a bit. Those verses in chapter Ezra 4, 7 through 23. These verses actually took place after Ezra chapter 6. But they took place also before Ezra chapter 7. Oops, I did that wrong. Let me bring that back. That's what I wanted to do. And so you can see how two of those flip-flopped. The beginning and the end are the same, but the two in the middle have flip-flopped positions. And the question kind of goes around, well, why? Why would it be like this? It's rather confusing when we read it this way. And if we, depending on how we read it, if we didn't know the nature of the succession of kings in Persia or the years that this took place, we may interpret it in a different time period altogether because of the names of the different kings that are involved. And so why is it like this? Why do we have this section of Ezra that's out of place? Well, two reasons. First, it could be that the author of the book wanted to keep like themes together. All right. Thus, when speaking of opposition to the building of the temple, which is where we are in Ezra chapter 4, even though it was out of place chronologically, it fit there with the theme of the opposition. A second reason could have to do with the language that it was written in. Ezra chapters 1 through 3, a few verses in chapter 4, they're written in Hebrew. Well, most of Ezra chapter 4 and most of chapter 6 are written in Aramaic. And then everything after that is written back in Hebrew again. And so these rogue verses in Ezra 4 may have been placed there because of the language that they were written in, rather than in the middle of chapter 6. We really don't know, but either way you look at it, while it looks like an error, it is commonly known that the author would have intended it this way. It was probably something audiences of the time would have been able to understand. For us, though, without a heading indicating as such, we can take those few verses in Ezra 4, and we kind of look at them as a flash forward, which is kind of what we're doing here. And so today, starting in Ezra chapter 7, though, after that, everything is in chronological order going forward through the reign of Artaxerxes. Today, though, we're going to get into the book of Nehemiah. And amazingly, because we have just gone through the book of Ezra, we won't need a big introduction because we know where we are. We know we are in the middle of a story, not just starting a new one. And so as you remember reading those first few verses in Ezra, we kind of stopped and we talked about it a little bit to kind of set the stage. We don't have to do that here because we know where we're going and we know where we've been. And so if we had not read Ezra, we would definitely have to take some time to figure out where we are. Because the opening verses of this book, if we were to just start it on its own, don't really define for us the beginning of anything. It doesn't even assume that we know what's going on. It just starts right into the story. And this is because Ezra and Nehemiah were originally published as one book together called Ezra, which I think we've talked about. If we haven't, there you go. Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book called the book of Ezra. But then they got separated. If you want to know more about that, just let me know and I'll give you some information on that. So, going back to my Star Wars trilogy analogy, since I always like to bring Star Wars into this, we're going to see that we're moving into the third story of the three. The first story gave us a new hope in the rebuilding of the temple, the holy place of God, and I just called that Zerubbabel Hope, because it focused on the actions and the mission of Zerubbabel. It kind of set the stage. And then last week, in Ezra Strikes Back, we got into the nitty-gritty of the law. We worked on the relationship between the people, and then how that affected that relationship with God. And we had to cut ties so that other ties could be formed. We were shocked at some parts of the book of Ezra, and the book kind of ended with our jaws just kind of hanging, right? Okay, kind of like the end of Empire Strikes Back in Star Wars. That's kind of what you finish the movie if you're watching it for the first time. That's kind of the reaction you're supposed to have. And so today we're going to get into this third story, the return of Nehemiah, I call it, the conclusion of the trilogy, except that we know that this story does not take us to the end of Nehemiah. Because we're only going halfway through the book. We're going to see some familiar themes pop up. We're going to see another opposition, of course. Nehemiah's job will be to complete the rebuilding of Jerusalem by rebuilding the wall around the city. And yet, though much work is put into the completion of this project, opposition and questions will still leave us wondering, what the heck is going on here? It's going to leave us with an okay, that's great, but I feel like there must be something else coming. And we might be asking the question, what happens next? Okay? And so that's where we're going to go today, and we are going to get right into it, looking at Nehemiah chapter 1. I'm just going to read the whole chapter for you as we get started, and then we'll talk about it in just a second. So let me bring up Nehemiah chapter 1. And we'll go through it here. So, Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 11, that's the whole chapter. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. So he's asking about some of the exiles that have already returned to Jerusalem, as we've read about in the previous stories. They said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. He's talking about that's the state the city has continued to be in. It's not that something new has happened, as far as I understand it, but that part of the city had not been cared for yet. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. This is Nehemiah again. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant. Hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. See, all that is underlined, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Then they are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. I was cupbearer to the king. Kind of a random side note there, but that's just how the chapter ends. And so we start off with a man named Hanani, which could also otherwise be called Hananiah, which means God is gracious. And he comes to Nehemiah, which his name means comfort of God. We'll think of that as we go through the story here. And so he's basically asking, how are the people doing? How are they doing in Jerusalem since they've left? How are they getting along? And so Hananiah comes to Nehemiah and says, well, the people, they've gone back, but Jerusalem is rather troubled. There's been some rebuilding going on, but not everything has been finished. The wall is still broken down. And it reminded them of the past destruction. Kind of depressing to look at ruins that kind of remind you of a very traumatic piece of history in your heritage. And so nothing would be fully restored until that wall was up, giving a sense of protection and completing that city. So essentially, things aren't good. Things aren't good. The people are in distress. The people who were living there are not treating them well at all. The walls are still broken. And Nehemiah is moved by this. And we know that some of those Israelites did not go back, right? I mean, we know some of them stayed in Babylon, in the Persian Empire. And that's okay. I mean, they didn't have to go back. They found a good life. Even went on to write some very important writings in the Jewish religion, particularly the Talmud, was written by Jews in Babylon. And so when Nehemiah hears about this, he's troubled. And he wants to do something about it. Kind of like how the people back in the beginning of our stories, we've talked about this, how it must have been God that really moved the people to want to go back. Because they were doing so well where they were. I mean, it was not, I mean, yes, they were in exile, but they had started up a life there. And so Nehemiah was moved. And I have to say, this has to be something from the Lord for that to happen. And he breaks down. And so he prays. We might understand Nehemiah as kind of being a new Joshua. Kind of like we thought of Ezra being a new Moses. We were talking about the Exodus. Kind of through the story here and some of the references that we get to the book of Exodus. And so we kind of remember Moses leading the people through the wilderness, and Joshua then leads them into the promised land. And so Moses and Joshua are very much alike, and so are Ezra and Nehemiah. We're going to see a little bit of a comparison between the two. But even right here, how he is referring back to that time when Moses is preparing to hand everything over to Joshua. We get, I want to go back to those underlined verses in Nehemiah 1. Here, I'll show them to you before I switch it over to something else here. And I want to show you how they are very similar to words that come up in Deuteronomy chapter 30. when Moses is speaking before they go into the promised land with Joshua. Remember what you told Moses. And then Deuteronomy 30. This is where even Jeremiah and Ezekiel, those prophets, get their hope from. They get their hope from Moses. And Nehemiah is one and the same, just like Joshua, getting their hope from Moses. And so now I want to fast forward here and show you Deuteronomy 31 through 6 and see if you see anything similar to that. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from the nations where he scattered you. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land, here we go, under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. Almost a cut and paste right there from Nehemiah 1. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, and you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. Good words right there. Very, very close. Further convincing us that just as Nehemiah is taking on words from Moses as kind of an inspiration here, he is really taking on that role of being a new Joshua. And so he's going back. He's going to go back and he's going to help take care of the walls. And while he does so, we're going to come upon some opposition. But the opposition comes a couple different, more than once, let's just say. There are 7 forms of this opposition during the part of the story. We'll only talk about a few, but it's very easy to spot. Okay? So whenever you read in these couple chapters of Nehemiah, when you see the words something, this person heard of something that was being done, then they form some sort of opposition. If you go ahead and read that, we'll talk about a few of them as examples, but if you want to go back through there and see the different times that this comes up, it's always about hearing and then doing something to stop it. And again, this is another reference to Joshua, because the same thing punctuates that story of Joshua in the Promised Land. Some people hear about stuff that Joshua and the Israelites are doing, and then they form an opposition and start an attack or something like that. They hear something, they start moving. Joshua chapter 9, the beginning of Joshua chapter 9 is probably one of those areas. You can just read the first couple verses of that chapter, Joshua 9, and you'll see that language right there. The same language that we're going to get here in Nehemiah. It's wild, absolutely wild. But anyway, back to the story. We get into Nehemiah chapter 2. Nehemiah's moved by all this, but nothing has happened yet, okay? He hasn't gone back yet. He's a cupbearer to the king, so he's a very important official in the king's court. He can't just up and leave, all right? So we're going to see what is going to happen now that Nehemiah knows what's going on. He knows he needs to do something. What's the Lord going to do? How's he going to work? So let's go to Nehemiah chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it you want?" And then I prayed to the God of heaven and answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah," that's Jerusalem, "where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of the Trans-Euphrates?" That's basically anything west of where they are right now, which is where Jerusalem is, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. "And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so that he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me," see, Nehemiah even knows that this is the Spirit of God working here, "the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent an army of officers and cavalry with me." All right? And so as we get into chapter 2, right here, the king that is named will remind us where we are in time. And so the timeline, of course, begins with Cyrus, right? That's who we heard about at the beginning of Ezra. And then we remember, as we talked about at the beginning, we have a little time lapse here. And so Darius comes next, and then Artaxerxes. So we've moved forward a bit in time. And these are at least the names of the kings that are mentioned in the books that we know of. And so through these stories, and though we've gone fast through time, and there are other kings with very similar names, we're going through a little bit fast. But we're taking the time to say, okay, we need to see how everything else is developing first as we go forward here. So Nehemiah right now is still upset at what's going on, and the king finds out that since Nehemiah is he's really close with him, being his cupbearer. Nehemiah is an Israelite who is an official in a foreign land, being the cupbearer to the king. Kind of may be reminiscent of the Joseph story, if you know that. Anything about the Joseph story in the book of Genesis. Joseph wasn't necessarily a cupbearer to the king, but he was basically Pharaoh's number 2 in Egypt. He was in a very trusted position. A cupbearer is a very trusted position because it would be very easy to poison a king, to poison royalty, by slipping something into a drink. So for Nehemiah to have this position, not only just himself or anybody, but mostly also because he's an Israelite, he's a foreigner, for him to have this position, it shows us that he's a very trusted individual. But he's sad, he's depressed, and you don't act that way when you're on the job, especially in the presence of royalty like this. And so the king notices. And the king can do whatever he wants here, but he asks what's wrong. And so Nehemiah tells the king what's up. He's like, my people are hurting, man. I can't hold it in. I'm just down. And so the king asks what he wants. And Nehemiah explains that he wants to go on a mission trip, right? What king's going to let him go and do that? But the king says, sure, go ahead. How long is it going to take you? And so Nehemiah tells him how long it's going to take. And the king says, go on, get out of here. And he also gets a whole bunch of stuff to go with too. And so in the presence of the king, he asks to go back to Jerusalem. The king gives him the royal treasury. Here you go, have fun, do your mission. So, what's the main point? What's the point of that? The main character here who hears about the desolation in Jerusalem, his heart is broken. He's so bothered by this passion inside him that he just can't hide it. It even catches the eye of the king. It's that bad. And so is it a coincidence that he who happens to be the cupbearer to the king shows this sadness? Is it a coincidence that the king was in a good mood that day? Nehemiah could have been demoted. Kind of ironic that he wasn't. And you kind of think someone must be working behind the scenes here, right? Just like the story of Esther, which comes right after this book. Working behind the curtain, there's God in all of this. And so this is how God's providence works in the midst of God's people. This is how God answers prayer. It just happens. It's not always a strategic 5-year plan or anything like that. It's God's Spirit moving in, around, and through what's going on in the story. So God orchestrated this whole thing. And so I'm going to bring back this map one more time. I think one more time. We'll see if we need it again. And so Nehemiah is going, and he's getting some help. he's on his way, and once he finally gets to Jerusalem, he doesn't make a big deal about it when he gets there. And during the night, when he could be by himself, he assesses the project. He inspects the condition of the wall. I mean, his character is shining through right here. He knows he knows he's not in it just to say, okay, this is what we're going to do in 10 years. This is where we're going to be. He's not just gathering facts. He's going at night. He's surveying the wall. He's gathering data. He's getting ideas. And then he's going to put a plan in place when we get into Nehemiah chapter 3. And Nehemiah chapter 3 shows us a list of people that are working on different parts of the wall. And just the way that chapter is written, you can basically form, it basically forms a circle around all of Jerusalem, from this gate to that gate, who's doing this, what they're using, things like that. And so they didn't start just in one place and work all the way around. I mean, you had this family working on this section. The Andersons are over here. The Joneses are over there. That family's working on that section of the wall. I mean, and so you can imagine each part of this wall having its own character and personality based on who was building it. It wasn't going to look like kind of the Great Wall of China being uniform in such and how it looks. It would kind of have its own intricacies that would make each part be special on its own. And this is kind of the part of the story where churches might read this and start thinking about building campaigns, right? Because you see people working together, they're throwing in their support. Each family has a part to play. And so, yeah, churches kind of use this part of the story for building campaigns, saying that we can work together, we can raise enough money to fix the steeple on top of the church, or get new pews, or help Ethel get a new kitchen, things like that. No offense in any of that. But yeah, that's where that idea would come from, is from this, from seeing everybody work together, Nehemiah orchestrating this plan to put people together to build this wall around Jerusalem. But now that we're starting this project, everything looked like it's going good, and darn, we just find this sign again, expect delays. We're going to start reaching the opposition. In fact, it has already started, but maybe we haven't seen it yet. Right? I'm going to show you in a moment, but when this whole rebuilding process starts going, there is a lot of opposition. Okay? And, I mean, yes, some churches, they read these books in preparation for a big revival in their church. Sort of like ours. I mean, we're going through a strategic plan here at Zion, looking at building a vision for moving into the future. But I wonder how many of the people will read it for the wrong reasons or get the wrong points out of it. In any revival, any strategic plan, there's going to be opposition to it, right? There's going to be a lot of change going on here, lots of difference. And so now these leaders, being so prayerfully and godly minded, they could have interpreted this opposition as divine disapproval. Nehemiah could have taken this as saying that when things are just starting to go wrong, when there are so many stumbling blocks, it can feel like God is just trying to tell you that you're making too big of a change, that it's not going to end well if you keep going. But none of the leaders, along with Nehemiah, treated it like this. They just kept going. They believed in their heart that what they were working toward was God's will, and that the opposition was not meant to tell them to stop, but instead to keep pushing harder. Okay? And so within our story here, when Nehemiah faces the opposition, he does not see it as divine disapproval. And like I said, there are 7 of these pieces. When somebody hears of something, someone's going to do something about it. So imagine now making a plan, and say 2 or 3 people you've never met before make it their sole mission in life to shut that plan down. I mean, has that ever happened to you? I mean, certainly that never happens in the church, right? No. Oh, it happens all the time. I mean, this is why opposition can immediately show us that things won't work. Um, but God's presence with us, God's providence moves us forward. Opposition is what holds us back and how we treat it. And Nehemiah chapters 2 through 4 is going to help us kind of with this. How do we trust God's providence through opposition? And so I want to show you a few of these parts things that have taken place so far. I know the print is small, but I wanted to try to get them all on one page. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, yada 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 yada, something happened. And then again in verse 19, something. They heard about it, something happened. And then again, when Sanballat heard, in chapter 4, verses 1 through 2, we get the same thing coming back again. And so we have this theme the first 3 times when we've got some opposition going on. And so the people are getting discouraged at this point, and Nehemiah encourages them to keep on going. And together they build the whole wall all the way around to half its height. All right, so now we got basically, it's half a wall. It's kind of like a fence. They've built a fence around Jerusalem to half the height of the wall. In a way, I think it's probably higher than a fence, but they're starting to get tired. I mean, they're motivated, but they're getting tired, and the opposition is growing. Now they're threatening to attack the Israelites and prevent the wall from getting finished because their opposition is seeing this wall's going up. We need to step up our game if we're going to stop them. And so, in the middle of Nehemiah chapter 4, we get a Braveheart moment, right? Okay, I mean, everyone's afraid. They're just not willing to go on. And so Nehemiah, he stands on the wall, he gets everyone's attention, and he makes a speech. He's going to quote from the book of Joshua. He's going to quote from the book of Deuteronomy. I mean, come on, this guy is a leader, okay? And so he is going to make a speech. And this is it. Nehemiah 4:13 through 18. I almost want to read this in a Scottish accent, but I'm not going to. So it says, "Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. And after I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, 'Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes.'" And can you feel that? When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. I mean, wow, that must have been a pretty good speech. That would be a Hollywood speech right there. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. So they're protecting the people who are building. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. So now they're not only not tired anymore, they are doing their work. They're doing their work with one hand and holding a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. I mean, this is the big movie speech that we are waiting for. People now doing work with one hand. I mean, morale's increasing. Their strength is coming back. Everything's getting better. I mean, what a leader Nehemiah is. And so, I mean, if you were to Google biblical leadership, I mean, you might come up with this story with this name. Nehemiah is a very wise person. He's a good leader. Even though these books are not, the best way to design or define a building campaign, he's a good leader. And as characters, we learn We learn from him, from his character. He led a people through a time of crisis when the people thought their identity was lost. And so everything is looking good once again. But then Nehemiah chapter 5 comes in. We're going to find that Nehemiah 5 is a little bit, it's a little bit discouraging. It says, "Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, 'We and our sons and our daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain.' Others were saying, 'We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine.' And still others were saying, 'We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. And although we are the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." And so chapter 5 here sticks out like a sore thumb in this whole story. I mean, everything else is inspiring. God's providence. I mean, yes, trust God. In Nehemiah chapter 5, we don't know when this happens. It just comes. The people and their wives cried out. There are people starving. We have to borrow money for the Persian taxes. And now also we have to sell our children as slaves. I mean, we're helpless. All of a sudden, from a happy picture that we get in this, everything looked good on paper, and then reality hits. I mean, there's social inequality, there's financial challenges, and it makes Nehemiah angry. Ezra got angry at this point in his story, and so does Nehemiah. I mean, he sees them breaking the law of Moses. I mean, they can't charge interest to fellow Israelites for loans. And so Nehemiah is like, come on, guys. This doesn't have to be difficult. We're rebuilding our heritage here, not trying to make a profit. All you're doing is making it worse for your fellow neighbors. I mean, listen to this. And Nehemiah explains his own situation. He says, hey, here's this. I was given permission to do this from the king. I could have used so many supplies, but I used a modest budget. You know, he was given all this stuff from the king, but he didn't use it all. He says, I could have worked off of your tax money, but I didn't. I could have ate choice food given to the governors of this area, but I didn't. I dedicated myself to rebuilding that wall for your sake. That's what I did. And now you should treat this whole thing with a whole lot more respect. So why is this whole thing not working? I mean, everything was working just fine. The plan was there. It was good. But now from the outside, from within, it's just, there's a lot of opposition here. And so Nehemiah, in a way, he likes to talk himself up. and I mean, the people did this, he says, and it's not good, but he says, I did better. And yeah, it can sound a bit cocky on his part, but I mean, he's right. I mean, at the end of chapter 5, he makes sure that God knows this as well. He says, remember me for what I have done. Okay? I mean, and he did do good. I mean, he's a good leader. And despite the opposition, despite what was going on around him, the wall was completed. In 52 days, that wall was done. And then Nehemiah chapter 7 is kind of the final area of where we are going to be in our story today. It's showing a long list of people who returned from exile. And if you look at this list and you go back to Ezra chapter 2, you would see that it's the same list. And so is the author trying to bore us here? I mean, we're never really fans of long lists of names in the Bible. We tend to kind of glaze over them or fall asleep. So is the author trying to bore us again by giving us the same list? No. He says something's going on here. These two chapters, Ezra chapter 2 and Nehemiah 7, they're bookends. It's taking us back to the beginning of the story. The first exiles coming back, and now remembering here what has been accomplished from that work. The opposition in this section of the story has to do with people who are just a thorn in your side. I mean, those people that will just want to pick a fight over anything. I mean, you see them all the time, right? I mean, you see them everywhere. It can be tempting to just throw in the towel and say there is no point. They're always going to be there. Why be miserable? But Nehemiah stuck with it. He armed a few people. He protected the builders. He continued on his mission. What's interesting, though, is that the prophet Zechariah had talked about how the new Jerusalem would be a city without walls. God's presence would be what surrounded it. And people of all nations would come and be a part of God's people. We get that from Zechariah chapter 2. We're going to look at that in just a minute. He said that Jerusalem would be a city without walls. And so let me bring that up. I want you to see this. Zechariah chapter 2 says, "Then I looked up, and there before me was a man with a measuring line in his hand. I asked, 'Where are you going?' He answered me, 'To measure Jerusalem, to find out how wide and long it is.' While the angel who was speaking to me was leaving, another angel came to meet him and said to him, 'Run, tell that young man, Jerusalem will be a city without walls, because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord, and I will be its glory within.'" Interesting. So in a way here, Nehemiah is operating with a very different vision. I mean, it's almost like he's pulling an Ezra right here and interpreting as he needs to in order for these things to be done. I mean, he is like Ezra. I mean, just like Joshua is kind of like Moses. Was Nehemiah right in what he did? Well, at first, it seemed like it. We're all for him getting Jerusalem set up. We're like, go, Nehemiah, go. Do it. But with all this tension mounting, we might discover that the people who were in opposition might actually be trying to reference the words of Zechariah saying that Jerusalem should not be a city with walls. Again, what it probably goes back to is Ezra and his actions on bringing the people back to being God's people and what that might mean for them. It's a very bold choice on his part, and we could interpret it as being right or wrong. The same is true with people who are in opposition to what we believe we are doing for the sake of God's mission right now in the 21st century in our own congregations. I mean, we have people who refuse to go along with anything that we do, and they might, and don't lash out at me here, they might actually have a good point. They may not be speaking heresy when they go up against you. I mean, they might have very sound reasoning, even if it does sound annoying, and even if it does eat away at you day after day. What we then see here is that even in the face of Nehemiah, even in the face of that, Nehemiah grounded himself in his mission. And we might go along with it also, believing that by finishing the walls of Jerusalem, God's covenant people would return to their roots, take up their previous traditions and rituals, all to return to their previous intimate relationship with God. Nehemiah wanted them to return and rebuild themselves as a people. So what does this say about Zechariah then? What does this say to the audience who would have read this at that time? Remember, the people hearing this would be going back to the prophet Jeremiah, who foretold that this all would happen. They would also listen to Zechariah, who said that Jerusalem would be rebuilt. I mean, Israel was headed closer to the Messianic age when God would send his Savior to the people. Anyone listening to this story would see all the pieces starting to fit together into place, and that this rebuilding was going to be the one where God's Messiah would come down and restore Israel once and for all. I mean, it was going to be the best and most well-known return and rebuild of all time. But through the story, there are hiccups. There are highs. And don't get me wrong, there were highs, but there were hiccups. And as great as this story of return and rebuild is, we are also being led to see that the people are still broken, just like we are today. that it is going to take more than just a group of dedicated individuals to rebuild that foretold New Jerusalem. They would need to go beyond the rebuilding of the city walls or the temple or the reteaching of the law. They would have to rebuild their own hearts. But once they realize that they can't, it will lead them to look not at their own two hands for their hope and salvation, but to God's own two hands. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. There is still some good news ahead of us in this next section of the book. And so we kind of close out here seeing these stories that we've just gone over, how we've gone through the same basic storyline through all of these, from Zerubbabel Hope, from the first half of Ezra Strikes Back, the second half, to right now the return of Nehemiah. They've gone through these ups and downs. We've seen opposition, we've seen motivation, morale, but there's still something missing. And like I said, we're going to still have some more highs and some more lows ahead of us. And that's what we're going to get into next time. And so this trilogy of stories is finished. What was initiated in the beginning has been completed. But there are still some questions left over. And for next week, we'll have you look into the next few chapters here. Here's your homework for next week. I want you to read Nehemiah chapter 8 through chapter 12, verse 43. I know it's kind of almost toward the end of chapter 12, but the end of chapter 12 is where things kind of take a different turn, and we'll at least start out reading just through verse 43 in chapter 12. And so that's going to do it for today, finishing out this trilogy of stories here. And so I'm glad that you were able to stick with it. I know some of these videos have been pushing it a lot on time, but there's just so much good stuff in this. And when I get going, I just get going, and I just keep talking. So again, if you have any questions as you go through this, or if you have any thought to the questions that I've put forward, you can email me, Pastor Mathew at zlcbrentwood.org. I'd be happy to talk to you about any of these and just kind of flesh through these questions with you. But until next time, when we get together, we'll finish out, we'll not finish out the book of Nehemiah, but we'll get close to it. Just a couple more weeks left in this series, and we'll be finished with it. But some good stuff that we've gone through so far, and some more good stuff ahead of us as we go. It's all good stuff, of course. But as we finish up for today, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord's face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you with favor and give to you his peace, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. God's peace to you all this day. We'll see you all next week as we continue this study series, Return and Rebuild, Ezra, Nehemiah, an ancient story for a modern church. God's peace to you all. See you next time.